Okay, thank you. All right, okay. Hi, everyone. This is the start of August 1st, the Carpenter Working Group. First off, let's get started with project updates. Main project update that we wanted to call out is our progress to 1.0. We are we're kind of in the home stretches. We have the CRD conversion webhooks main key features in such as like consolidate after and a few provider specific, at least for the AWS side, features merged in. We're planning on hopefully getting out a release soon. We're making progress on that. And then the next project update is cascading deletion. I think Jonathan wants to uh, add more on that. Let's provide an update
Oh,
there.
it wasn't a project update. Sorry, that was a community question. I think we can push forward on that.
Oh, okay. Okay then. In that case, let's just kind of move on. Let's move forward to RFC. Um, Firstly, I think we've discussed this already a few times, node overlay. There is an RFC up for node overlay. Just looking for more comments if anybody would like to add anything else.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. You want me to write it now? What was it? GitHub. GitHub. AWS.
Uh,
Just missing here.
You're not on mute.
yeah, sorry, Torben. Are you okay? Did you have a question, Torben? Torben?
No, I was just not on mute. I don't know why it's unmuting me. Sorry.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Yeah,
Um,
mute me.
so we Yeah, so we have the node overlay RFC out. If anybody has any questions, if they would like to provide any comments. We've discussed this several times now, but yeah, this is kind of still going through review a little bit. Yeah, so any questions, comments on this? If none, then we can kind of move along, and if you get a chance, please take a look and give some feedback.
Is this intended to go into V1 or will it be short soon after?
This is not intended to go for V1.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not coming V1, it's coming sometime later.
Yes.
Okay. Uh, are you looking for something specific from this review? Like, it seems like it was like a start to something that might expand further beyond, but then it's not changing. Do we want to capture more things upfront?
So, my understanding is this RFC is out just to kind of outline the use cases that we expect to see for node overlay, and what we're trying to solve for. Now, if it's my understanding right now, we're also starting to the most basic cases, the most widespread, the use cases that will help and impact the most customers, and then adding and expanding on more once we understand, different use cases and are able to develop the idea more.
Got it.
So yeah, practically speaking, Ellis was kind of charging ahead with this RC and then he went on paternity leave. So that's that's the practical implication of this. It's not going to die. Like there's other people on the maintainer team that are going to be picking up the work. But that if you're wondering why there hasn't been like a ton of movement, that's the main reason.
I got it. I was like, it kind of got stuck. So I was like, are we waiting for more things or something? But that's good to know. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe this explains what I was going to ask. I left this question there, which is actually on the screen right now. I was a little bit confused about, well, I'd love to hear more about interaction between, client side pricing capabilities and server side pricing capabilities, like those from EC2 Fleet and, potential interaction between the two. So would still be interested in an insight there.
Yes, that's interesting. How does that affect Microsoft or Azure in general? Like what do you
It does not at this point until and unless we develop some server-side capabilities for picking up better price, which is a possibility. I was wondering what the thinking is, on the architecture in general, like division of responsibilities between Karpenter doing something itself, client-side or server-side APIs that are capable of some smarts.
Yeah, I think at least from the AWS side, like the Uber point is that these things have to be aligned to your point. Like otherwise they start fighting with each other. So at least from like the pricing prioritization ordering perspective, like the pricing would have to match. If you're using like a savings plan or some kind of like discounted pricing that you need to reflect in this kind of like node overlay based construct, that has to basically match what the server side view of the pricing is behind the scenes. Otherwise, you're going to see weird behavior where, I mean, at least from our side, like where we provide some set of options for launch, and then they choose one based on the server side view of the price, and Karpenter has a completely different view of the price, so it consolidates and then it tries to launch again, and it gets something that is more expensive, and it's just going to get into an instance launch loop.
Okay,
Um,
yeah,
so at the end of the day, those things have to match. I think there may be some possibilities where like at least on like fleet side for AWS, there's like prioritized as an allocation strategy. So, I mean, we don't support it, but you can imagine a scenario where if you wanted to like kind of implement your own form of prioritization, you basically override the pricing construct in node overlay, and then you pass that price to the actual API as like a prioritization ordering. And then you just, you effectively tell Fleet like what you care about in terms of the pure priority. I think for a lot of users, that's a lot of overhead. But I have heard some use cases for people thinking, okay, we have some understanding of our price performance for our applications. We know what's best for us, and so therefore we want to do the strict prioritization ourselves.
no, that makes sense, and the explanation helps a lot. It might not be totally clear to everybody, so it might be worth capturing here that essentially client-side logic has to match whatever server-side logic is used, and it's also useful for us because when we're thinking about introducing server-side capabilities, we're thinking, yeah, it would be great to support multiple allocation strategies, maybe. So it's good to know that whatever we use, it has to match the client-side logic. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Any other questions or comments? If none, then we can move on. Next, RFC is OTCR support. Irvin, Thorben, Jonathan, you guys want to add anything here?
I think I haven't looked at this since my PTO, coming back from PTO. Thorben, I think, has been busy as well. I've been busy, so I don't think we've hopped on this recently. I think we're planning to hop back on it next week unless Thorben, or if you had any other updates.
Yes, I'm planning to jump on this next week. I'm just very busy this week, and then the week before. It's like the timing is just not great.
Yeah, I remember there was an open question about the open ODCRs. Like we kind of reopened the question about like maybe we can discuss more offline, but how drift is affected when you use open ODCRs, because you can get into some weird edge case behavior if you decide to drift on. Like I think the original idea was
I
that
think,
you
I-
can
yeah,
specify.
I think there's going to be some edge cases when you use open, just because the way that open itself works, right?
Yeah.
I think the preferred way is, say, I would argue use targeted, because you can now use then targeted with Carpenter, right? Use the targeted ones, and just make it explicit with Carpenter, right? Versus kind of loosely coupling or like having some weird edge cases. But there is a feature that Corey brought up that you can actually, when you create an instance, you can say specifically, I don't want to use any ODCR, which adds another wrinkle to it. There's a lot of like, that's the problem. It's like every time you get something, there's like always an edge case. So we're just trying to, which edge cases do we implement and which ones do we just document? That's kind of the challenge that we kind of like, actually, I would say that's the most of the work that Jonathan and I have to do. Like, which one do we agree to implement to make it easy for users, and which one is the one that people have to accept when they use this, or like they have to be aware of?
I think we closed on pretty much everything except for the like when I launch with an open ODCR and it goes into an open ODCR and then I remove that open ODCR from my selection logic. I don't think I drift. I think that was the consensus that we'd hit. But anyway, there's some edge cases here. I think we're close, at least to get the RFC done.
Yes, yes. I think the goal is the RFC and then next week. I don't know.
Sounds good then. Okay, sounds good then. We can move on. Next thing, community questions. That having conversation about deprecated armies.
Do people call them Amis inside AWS?
Come again?
Did you pronounce it Amis?
Yeah, AMIs.
Yeah,
That's cool. I've never heard that before. Thank you for sharing that with me.
it's so funny.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, does anybody, I guess, want to discuss this? I think this is still just going through some review.
So I think we had a discussion, like on comments. So I just wanted to like talk about that. So there's some things that you basically wanted to change on that, right? Like for drift, and I'm
Okay.
confused on that part. Like if a more recent army is deprecated, do we just fall back to a non-deprecated army? Like, is that the thing that you were talking about? But usually drift works, like from what I tested.
Okay, yes, I think you may, I haven't had a chance to look at this last comment, but I think, yeah, so if my understanding was that we would, uh, if, if you had a set of armies, yeah, if you had a set of armies and the only one available to you is, a deprecated one would be okay, but if you have other ones available to you, then inside of the status condition of your EC2 node class, you would have that available. You're not a non-deprecated AMI, which then would cause you to drift entirely. Okay. Yeah, I will take a look back at this PR since I just haven't had a chance to get to look at this last comment.
Can we?
So what I did was in this, I basically tested drift in terms of when a new army becomes available and the previous one is deprecated, it does drift to the newer army, but it doesn't fall back to an army which is older, right? It doesn't do that right now. So say an army is created today and one is created yesterday, and the one that was created today is deprecated for whatever reason, it doesn't fall back to the one that was created yesterday. Like, does that make sense?
I would argue that the non-deprecated should always be preferred over deprecated, no matter the timestamp. Right? Because if someone releases an image and you get it and you take it, and then the way for someone to tell you that an image is deprecated, or like something is wrong with the image, they deprecate it, right? So you always want images that are not deprecated, right? And if just because that image, then it should fall back to the one from last week, for example, because that one hasn't been deprecated, it shouldn't always pick the latest. There should be, the first filter should be if a deprecated is if a non-deprecated AMI is available, use the latest of those. If only deprecated are available, use the latest of those. But it should be a drift if I'm on deprecated and the non-deprecated one is available, no matter the timestamp.
Yeah, I agree with you, Thorben. In my mind, at least when I started this conversation, it was just more of the fact to make sure that like when a selector is resolved, that we're the only time we don't drift and or are launching with a deprecate AMI is if we're only resolving that AMI. Like in most cases, we're resolving a bunch of AMIs and then picking out the most recent AMI, or like in this case as well, non-deprecated AMI, right? So that was just kind of more of the call out. But I think we can have more of this discussion as part of the thread.
Sorry, is there I'm curious if there's disagreement on that point, mainly.
I don't
When you mark an AMI or an AMI as deprecated in AWS, what's the intent there? Is the intent for no one to use that image, or is the intent to say
Yeah,
this
right.
image will be
So
no longer usable in the future?
There are three types that you can do. One is you either delete an image, you remove, so there is deprecated, then there are two more types. I forget the names, exactly the terms. But
Mhm.
an deprecated army is discoverable and usable. But the other two types, when you do use that, the army is just removed. So
Okay.
I would argue that, if an army is deprecated, it can be on a schedule. But
Yeah.
if there is an issue with an army, that means that it needs to be removed rather than deprecated, right? So
I could see an argument for keeping it around just for like dissection reasons later, but there may be like a better way to mark it such that it immediately becomes unusable. Because I do agree that deprecated is still implying somewhat that it is usable.
Is there disable? I don't actually know if disable is.
yeah, I think the disable there are three terms. I think that the one that I was looking for is disable. When you do a disable, the army is unusable, but it's still there.
Right.
Gotcha.
It does sound like deprecated is meant to be, oh, you can still use this.
Yes.
It's gonna be gone soon. You should move away when possible.
Yeah.
It's gone soon, but it's still like, so for example, right?
Right.
Auto-scaling groups, launch templates, everyone can discover that army. It's just that Karpenter fails because of that one flag.
Yeah.
So I think there are
Mm.
three different things that need to be done if an army needs to be removed completely from use, right? I don't think deprecated might be the right thing. Again, that's just from my understanding, and I might be wrong.
That sounds.
Isn't the use case we're trying to here? Isn't the use case we're trying to meet here that like there's some other team that is responsible for, I assume that's you, that's responsible for deprecating armies, and there's a bunch of application owners that don't, or people that have configuration in their clusters that don't have any visibility into that, and therefore like they should be able to continue to launch and not have Karpenter just crap out and fail on them, but they should be aware of the fact that like the army is deprecated. So we should do something like surface that in the status information or give a warning log and continue to launch, but just make users aware of the fact that they're using an image that's old. That
Yeah.
shouldn't be used.
Mhm.
That sounds good.
I guess the only other question is how we react to drift with that when an army becomes deprecated, right? It
sounds like
should just-
drift. You shouldn't drift, right? Like you shouldn't move. I guess you shouldn't move into a deprecated. And if your
Yes.
army is drifted, I mean, your army that you're using is deprecated, that's maybe okay until you discover a non-deprecated army comes out.
What's the situation that you would run into? Like you would move from a non-deprecated army to a deprecated army. Like that seems like a really weird edge case.
Yeah, exactly.
Only if you're pinning the ID, like if you were to update the ID on your army select in a way that you were intentionally trying to launch
do
a
that.
deprecated army, then you should be able to. I think it's a pretty, from like a code perspective, it's pretty straightforward. It's always prioritize non-deprecated, order those by creation date. Then if there only is leftover is deprecated, then like order those by creation date. And
But
that
if you
should-
do that, then you're going to prompt a drift, right? If
Uh,
like the one that you're currently using becomes deprecated, which is like the entire point of this ticket.
isn't that the goal? Am I missing something?
Goal
Like,
is-
isn't the goal that
goal
we
I think the
would-
goal is to stop drift from happening whenever the army becomes marked as deprecated.
No, the goal of this ticket is that currently deprecated are not supported in any shape or form. So
Yeah,
I see.
imagine the only MI
Mhm.
available to use deprecated, the environment is frozen right now.
Yeah. I could just see like a world where like Karpenter doesn't care if the army is deprecated or not. It doesn't do any kind of sorting logic based. The only thing it does is just mark like an event or something else telling you, hey, you're using a deprecated army. That's it. And then it just doesn't care otherwise.
I guess there's two problems here, right? Like there's the
Mhm.
I guess the problem of like you should drift or not. I think that's something we can like talk about separately or have a different issue for, because I think with the change in how we define drift, we can likely tell it, hey, you should drift on deprecated or not. It can be user configured, but I think not being able to discover deprecated is more problematic.
I think we should pick a position, and if we need to provide user configurability, then we surface that. But I don't honestly, genuinely don't feel like we need to. Like it feels sensible to me that if you have both deprecated and non-deprecated, that you would always go to the non-deprecated versions.
I think it does that already. It's just that the
But
edge.
no, it does not. It still does the latest first.
Yes, on based on creation, right? Like, so if, like I
But
said, like
we want the difference should be deprecated or non-deprecated. If a non-deprecated is available, timestamp does not matter. It should drift to the new one no matter the timestamp. If there's a non-deprecated one available, pick that one over any deprecated that's available.
got it. Okay.
Because you're giving someone who's giving you the AMIs, you give them the capability to move away from a deprecated one without needing to release a new image. Imagine you're in a situation where there's something wrong with that image that you just deployed, but you don't know what the problem yet is, but the last one worked. So you're just going to deprecate the one that you just published, and every your environment will automatically roll back to the previous one, and your issue goes away. And the person who is responsible for the AMIs, they can have some time to figure out what the problem is.
Yeah, but you could
But-
do that without deprecating that AMI as well, right? Like you can mark it as something other than deprecated that tells you that it's actually like bugged and non-functional. Like deprecated implies that it's still functional, it's just going away.
It,
What is that option?
I think,
Uh,
disable.
Disable.
Right.
Do we listen? But disable, we'd probably never filter for anyways.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
If you mark it disabled, then it shouldn't show up in the filters and then it should be cycled, right?
Can I do it? Can I disable? I think the problem is I cannot disable an image that's used by an instance.
Okay. That to me would be the real bug to solve, is that
That's an
process doesn't
AWS
work.
job. I think because
Yeah.
what
No,
they
you
do
can
is-
actually disable instances that are being used by instances, or images or armies that are used by instances. It's just that any new instance that is launched, it will not be able to look at that or find that at all.
So you're saying I can disable an image that's used by an instance currently?
Yeah.
Okay.
It might be worth mapping out this sorting logic out in this like feature so that we know explicitly, everyone knows like, okay, this is what first, second, and then whatever, if it's not listed already.
So it does that right now. The way that the sorting works is it always prioritizes, like the army sort logic will
Right.
always have the latest armies first, and all the deprecated last will the least priority. And all the deprecated armies are then sorted on the deprecation time. And then if the deprecation time is the same, then it looks at the army ID instead. The same thing that if the functionality there is currently for creation date. So that part is there. It's just like drift forward or drift backwards, if that makes sense, doesn't work. That's the only thing that I wanted to discuss, if that is the thing that we should do.
Drift backward doesn't work if you specify deprecation on the new AMI. Is that right?
Yep.
That's surprising to me. Okay.
I think we can have I think this conversation we can have as part of the or the PR.
Yeah.
That's all. Okay, cool. Then for the sake of time, let's move on to the next comment. Node claim lifecycle questions.
Yeah, thanks. So let me put some context here. I'm building a cluster API provider for Karpenter right now. And one of the challenges we have with cluster API is that we need to do like asynchronous node creation from the perspective of the information that Karpenter needs. So I kind of have some questions around the node claim and kind of its life cycle and whatnot. And looking at the code, it appears to me like when you create a node claim and when the create interface is called, the first condition that node claim will take is kind of the launching condition, and then it will go into a registering condition, trying to match the provider ID with a node that has the same provider ID. Now we don't know the provider ID when we first create the machine in Cluster API. So there's like a little bit of asynchronous action I need to do where I need to return the node claim and then I need to add the provider ID later. So one of the patterns I'm playing with right now is putting like a stub value into the provider ID when I first give it back. And then later when I detect that the instance has been created and I know the provider ID, then I can go back and find a node claim and say, okay, I'm going to fill this in with the proper provider ID now. So I'm curious, does that sound like a bad pattern to anyone? Is there any reason why that wouldn't work? Or does Core Carpenter depend on the provider ID being a certain thing? Like, does it use it outside of recognizing nodes? Or, I saw that it indexes the provider ID, presumably for lookups. Like, does the provider ID need to be unique inside, Carpenter Core? I know it uses UID to recognize the UUID to recognize the node claims internally to cache them and whatnot. But is there any reason it would use provider ID as like a uniqueness value there internally?
We use provider ID internally for state tracking. So we have like a mapping construct that would map on that key.
Okay. So
Oh, yeah.
I should give a unique value back then.
Yeah. There's some expectation that's unique within the context of Carpenter inside of the cluster. Yeah.
Now, what happens if I create a node claim with one provider ID and then later I update the provider ID on that? Would that mess up the internal logic?
That I don't know the answer to. I think not. I'd have to check though.
Okay, because my reading of the lifecycle controller or the instance lifecycle controller was that like it looked like it's gonna hold with that registering condition until it can match the provider ID to a node. So what I was thinking was I could let it hold the claim in that registering point and then put the real provider ID in when I know it, and then it should allow the node claim to progress after that. But it's these like internal caches or whatever that I'm kind of concerned about, or mappings, like you're talking about.
If you were to, yeah, I'm just trying to think. So from the CAPI side, like waiting could potentially take too long. Like, or like, what are the scenarios where you're watching with a cloud provider that it takes too long to resolve the provider ID?
I mean, it shouldn't take that long to get the provider ID, but because I'm not dealing directly with the cloud provider, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with like a scalable resource type where I'm going to increase a replica count. And then I'm going to have a separate controller that watches for like when new, what we call machines, that's the object associated with an instance. When a new machine is created, I could pick that up then and associate it with the node claim and say, okay, this was the instance that was supposed to go with that node claim. But I won't, unless I create a blocking operation to do that in the create, like, I don't think it's going to be like, I think unless I go the blocking route, I think this is the only way I can do it otherwise.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Trying to think if there are other options here. Yeah, you almost have to create like an alternative flow for, well, yeah, I guess we can continue to use the provider ID and you can do the step value like you were saying. The other option is like do some sort of alternative flow where we have like an alternative key. I'm not sure what the implications are of that for other cloud providers. You have to think about it. It'd be interesting to talk through that.
Yeah, well, I'm like very close to the point where I'm going to donate my repo back to Kubernetes SIG. So like I'm playing with some of the stuff now. I'm just trying to figure out what like errors I might see. So it might end up that it works and like, Carpenter's okay with it, but I guess we'll find out like soon. I'm just trying to like figure out what am I going to trip over here in the next week or two. Okay. So I guess like dovetailing on that then, I'll go to like the kind of fourth question I have there. Like, is it okay for a provider implementer to add like additional labels and annotations to a node claim? Because this might be another way to work around some of the synchronization for me. Is if I can add extra information in the form of labels or annotations on the node claim, then it'll make it easier for me to like filter them and kind of like figure out what's going on later. Is there?
Yeah, 100% you can do that because like we do that as AWS. We hydrate like additional labels that we're aware of that we're gonna have on the node for anything like specific for our resource requirements. So you could absolutely inject additional data for the CAPI provider.
Okay.
Is there a
awesome.
prefix that should be used for provider specific implementations? Rather than just like the general Carpenter SH?
Yeah, it's whatever the group is what we've done.
Okay.
So we've done like Carpenter Kate's AWS for their the AWS provider. I'm not sure what Azure's done.
Cool. Makes sense.
Okay, yeah, and I guess I would just use the CAPI prefix that we're already using, so it should be fine for us. Okay, cool. So then going back to my third question, then I noticed that like in the comments, the code comments around the instance type class, that the name value, it says it needs to correspond to the label instance type or the instance type label that exists on the nodes. Does Carpenter use that instance type information like in other ways that I should know about? Because this is another thing where like I won't know the instance type when I create something because like with Cluster API, I'm like one step removed from the actual provider. So whatever the provider actually ends up putting on the node as an instance type, I'll probably need to either label or do something so that I know what that is ahead of time. But I may not necessarily know that when I'm creating the instance. So I'm curious, like, does Carpenter use that internally some way that I should be aware of?
Yeah, this is why I'm thinking you may not like the stub may not work because the problem is if you don't resolve the instance type, like we can't even do a scheduling simulation because we don't know like what the size of that instance you just launched is.
Right.
So
I can fill in the size, but what I can't, like the name, if the name needs to associate to whatever the label is on the actual node that's created, that I'm just curious, do I need to make sure that those match up?
the instance type, that's interesting. I think we may use it in some places around drift, or no, not drift. We use it for consolidation pricing, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
I think that would be the only case where we actually use the instance type label now. Other than that, like you would still get like whatever you've put into the resources section or the status allocatable section
Right.
should be the simulation. But yeah,
Yeah, because like
you'd just be in a case where I don't think you could do any consolidation evaluation for that instance until you resolve that instance type.
okay, that may be part. I guess I'm going to learn more about this like asynchronous create because I'm starting to go into testing on this stuff now. So I guess maybe next time I'll have some interesting results or something. So I appreciate this. I might have some more questions. Jonathan, I might ping you on Slack if I run into more issues about this provider ID stuff, if that's
Sure.
cool.
Yep, sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much.
Well, Matt, you wanted to talk about I guess the, the current state of.
Yeah, I've been trying to build things. For a while, it was I was unable to use the Carpenter main branch with the Carpenter provider AWS main branch together. And just like yesterday or the day before, it's in a similar state again. Where I'm just like unable to do development on the latest main, unfortunately. Or at least like to build like a formal image. I could probably work harder to set up like Quack and stuff, but I don't even know if that would solve my problem. So I guess like my question is there kind of a like a plan to keep main healthy as like top priority going forward. I realize that switching to V1 is going to be like a big ordeal and that there's going to be bumps and stuff along the way. So, but just getting past that, I just want to ask if like that's a priority as part of the development for the project.
Yeah, so I guess I can talk about like we try to anytime we're making changes to upstream, we try to make it follow up at least from the AWS side to follow up with the necessary changes to make it into a buildable state. But sometimes certain changes that the review process can take can take a little bit longer. But I think typically we can probably do a better job of making sure that both PRs are in a good state or like PRs that are linked are both in a good state prior to merging either one of those. Yeah, I think we can potentially make a plan or a conversation about that. Would you mind creating an issue so that we can have a place to have
So
this?
sorry, real quick, I'm gonna jump in.
Sure.
Matt, from the perspective of unbuildable, are you building with the AWS provider?
Yes.
I see. Yeah. We generally shouldn't, to Emmanuel's point, I think we generally shouldn't see drift between those two things. Are you using a Go work file or are you like how are you building with both
I'm running a command to basically like point my local Carpenter provider AWS to my local Carpenter
You're on main on both,
directory.
or something like that?
Yeah.
I see. So you may not, like, even if we were pinning a particular version, like within the Go mod, you would still override it with your local version.
Right. Now I'm open to also just like if there's a better workflow, like if I'm supposed to be pinning to like a particular like stable version of like the main Carpenter repo whenever I'm building AWS, then maybe I need to understand better, like read where the docs are or add the docs so that people know that that's the intended workflow. This could just be my own ignorance. So
No, because I also run into this scenario as well, as we're like building out changes in the upstream repo. The downstream repo gets out of date, and then a separate PR has to go into the downstream repo to get that one up to date, so you can use both changes locally.
Mhm.
I think that's the nice thing about using Quark is it's self-contained. Because I think this will happen less like we are kind of charging ahead with V1, and therefore like we've been pushing a lot of changes in that are making these things out of date more frequently than they normally are.
Yeah.
Even still, like if we push a breaking change into the upstream repo, there may be a little bit of drift in there that would take us time to resolve because I think we'll update the Kubernetes 6 Carpenter version in AWS provider much less frequently after we launch V1. And so you may see, like similar to how you wouldn't update control runtime until they release a new, like their new minor version may break you in different ways, and you may not update it for a little bit. So yeah, that's where the Quark provider might be useful.
Even then, Quark's not going to help me actually like build and release like a change for testing and stuff. If I want to like get something that's going to work live, so it would only be for Quark.
Wait, sorry, what do you mean?
Like if I wanted to actually put a change into like a live test cluster to verify that it's going to work like for reals. Yeah.
Are you making changes on both repos or just the downstream one or the upstream one?
Typically it's just upstream, though we do have like a couple small patches on the Carpenter repo as well, or on the AWS provider repo. So one of them is for like CNI IP counting issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is like a bit of a problem that I don't know how to solve it, and then to say like we're going to we're going to like be less aggressive with breaking changes in the upstream repo post V1, and therefore we'd have less drift between those repos. Because yeah, the problem is hard to solve because like you're making changes on the latest on upstream, and if you want to test that with the AWS provider, like you've got to make the change. Or not you, but someone has to make the change.
It's almost like if we could tag like when a breaking change is about to come to the upstream repo, tagging like the last commit that is working for like that a particular provider would also be helpful because then I can just check out the tag or whatever and then build off of that without having to worry about the breaking change that's coming in from upstream.
Yeah, I think this is where we should be more disciplined about marking things as breaking post V1. There's a doc that Jason Deal was going to write on like defining what breaking change. I mean, I don't think it's that difficult to define them, but defining what breaking changes are so that other cloud providers are aware of these, and then we SIMVer them as we make those changes. And I think if we're more disciplined about marking those within the PRs themselves, it should be pretty obvious, but that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, I'm down to keep brainstorming on ways to make it better. I also feel like post V1 things will naturally be better as well.
Okay. Cool. If we're good on that, then
yeah, I think this is another unfortunate casualty of Ellis going on parental leave because he was the one who was talking to me about the design for this initially. But I would love to get some feedback on if this is like the right direction we want to go for implementing a feature like this. The only thing I'm like kind of concerned about right now is that it works across all forms of consolidation, being like multi and single, and that could potentially like restrict setting it to a value that works for single consolidation reduction could block multi-node consolidation that you would want to happen. But I think node overlay will help with that regard, since you'd be able to take into account like extra like static per node costs, and which would also be factored in.
Is there a write-up on this? I'm just curious.
There is an issue open, and that should be linked in the conversation, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
But basically, this is the general gist of it is that like consolidation is happening like really frequently, and this is another way to kind of curb it to say like, oh, I only want to do single node consolidation if we're going to get like a real price gain out of it.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. What would you set this value to?
I am kind of going back and forth, probably not more than like 20%. I think that'd be really aggressive. Honestly, I think if we can do something like 5%, to where like that may be sufficient, but I would also need to test it more with data, which I can't build a repo right now. So I want to like deploy this into like some of our bigger QA environments because it's a pretty low risk change, and then just kind of start playing with it to see what value makes sense.
Got it. So what's the success criteria in your mind? Like just monitoring how frequently you get consolidation, weighing that against your price gains. Like how are you gonna determine that a value is
Yeah.
good?
Yeah, that's it. Basically would be like looking at the consolidation rates, seeing what kind of like actual improvement values we're seeing. Like whenever Carpenter decides to do consolidation, like what gain did we get out of that? And then kind of looking at the numbers and arriving at a this feels good type place.
Got it.
Yeah, I'm not big on the idea of trying to set like a fixed hard-coded value inside Carpenter for this, simply because I think that this value is going to depend on each user's preferences, on like how much disruption they're willing to take for marginal cost improvements. But if it, I don't know, if I look at the data, I might convince myself otherwise.
Are you gonna, I assume you're gonna leverage consolidate after, Matt, as well?
That, yeah, if that's available in V1, I think we'll start playing with that. Although that one is a little more interesting because I'm not sure how well the it working based on pod scheduling is going to play for us. But I'll have to try it and see, mainly.
Why do you say that? Just curious.
Because we could have cases where like nodes just get like blocked from consolidation forever, for like even if we have like a consolidate after set to like 30 minutes, it could just be that like jobs are coming into schedule like in the cracks around like stable workloads and stuff. Because we have we run clusters with a lot of like very different types of workloads. So we have like long running like multi-hour jobs that run in like in the cracks basically around lots of like stable workloads. So it could be the case that like those nodes just get blocked from consolidation ever if we have a consolidate value too high. So. But yeah, I'm willing to give it a try and see how it works and see what the real numbers look like. But ultimately, we're just trying to reduce cases where things like pods are being disrupted for like very marginal gains that don't mean a whole lot.
Yep.
Okay. Sounds good. If nothing else, if you want to add nothing else, then we can move on to the yeah. This is Jonathan, cascading delete.
Yeah, so I had a quick question for folks on the call here. I think there was an issue for this. Let me see if I can find it. I need to reopen it, I think. So the question is basically, if I'm trying to remove, and I don't know how common this is for y'all, so maybe just because y'all are using Carpenter frequently, and so I doubt that you're doing a lot of install on install. But in the case that you're removing Carpenter from your cluster, and you want to spin down everything that Carpenter owns, there's kind of a question about like how that process should be performed and if that process should be graceful or not. One option is that, if you're running a cluster and you're orchestrating the spin down of that cluster and you want to do a helm delete and necessarily like remove Carpenter, remove the CRDs, remove all of the resources that Carpenter owns, and the pods on that cluster don't have anywhere to go to. Carpenter's just going to sit there hanging for a really long time because it's not able to drain the nodes, and it's going to try and like delete the CRDs, gracefully delete the node pools, gracefully delete the node claims. Those node claims are going to start draining the nodes. The pods are going to hang there because they're not able to be removed. and then it just sits there effectively forever. This maybe changes a little bit with termination grace period, but let's imagine
Yeah.
the fact using termination grace period here because you weren't trying to use it during the stand-up of like your normal representation of Karpenter. Like, is the expectation that when you're when you're deleting Karpenter with like a helm delete, that it just forcefully removes everything and like shuts everything down that's owned by Karpenter? Or that process would be graceful and you're able to gracefully migrate your workloads from one type of capacity to another, and you're willing to accept like Karpenter hanging there if it's not able to gracefully remove those workloads?
I would expect that if I do a Helm uninstall of my Karpenter deployment and all of its CRDs, it will forcefully delete them.
Is that based on like getting that impression from like other projects and
Yeah.
how their
I mean,
resources work?
That's pretty standard for most
Well,
other projects, from what I can tell.
what's an example, if you don't mind?
Prometheus, Grafana,
That's
cluster
like tearing
autoscale.
down a data store, right? Like it's not like effectively you can think of like turning off the data store as being graceful. Like there's not like any kind of special
But-
cleanup that needs to happen when you turn down the metric store, right?
Correct, but I mean, you have an expectation that the people who are making, right, when you apply a state to a cluster, right, you have the expectation that the cluster is going to migrate to that state, regardless of whether or not you intended it to be that way or not, right? So if my intended action, my state that I want to get to is that Karpenter is removed from the cluster, including all of the CRDs, then I would expect that this state moves to there.
I think that like if you're deleting a deployment, for example, those pods, like all of the normal graceful cleanup stuff happens whenever you delete the deployment as part of cleanup of the pods, right?
Correct. I mean, that's, your graceful termination, right?
Yeah, I would expect the same thing to occur for nodes, which are being deleted as a result of deleting the CRD. Personally,
Sure. I mean, having like a graceful shutdown is fine, but I mean, the question is basically, do you want a finalizer, right, on a lot of these on essentially Karpenter resources to ensure that, your EC2 instances have been stopped, before you delete the CRDs that manage those instances and so on, right? Right. That's essentially
Yeah.
what the question is.
Yeah, I think that's not, in my mind at least, that's not up for debate. Like I think that's absolutely yes, that should happen. And like if we can't gracefully delete the instance, then I think that should block us. I think the question is like something that can indefinitely hang due to like a pod deletion workflow that you don't necessarily own. And maybe this goes back to like the termination grace period concern. Like maybe the workaround here is like you apply termination grace period 0, or like I think we created a label, Matt. I mean you apply termination grace period 0, where you like apply the annotation or label to all node claims on your cluster, and that just there you can use or initiate a forceful deletion through that mechanism.
I think there's definitely room to, if you want to be able to support both, you can definitely leverage termination grace period for that purpose.
It reads it, so remind me again, Matt, because I didn't do the last review of the PR. It's if the second it's deleted, it applies the timestamp to the node claim, and at that point, it doesn't read the termination grace period anymore. Is that right?
That's correct.
So you'd have
you could even work around the feature without having to replace all of the node claims if you wanted to, just by annotating everything.
That's
all the node claims.
You would basically initiate the deletion, but you have to orchestrate this. That's the only thing, right? You have to orchestrate the deletion of Helm chart and then orchestrate the annotation across all your node claims to do the force delete.
Yep.
If I'm planning to delete, if I'm planning to delete, if you're planning to delete yourself, like when you delete the node pools and node classes first before you start thinking about deleting Karpenter?
I would love the opportunity to not have to care about that and just for it to do the natural thing as soon as it can. So like whenever, basically this is the primary case where I'm going to be doing this is when I'm tearing down a cluster for the most part, is when I see myself doing this. And if I can put Karpenter into a deleting state and have it gracefully block until everything's been sufficiently cleaned up, that allows me to not care about the order that I'm doing the teardown of the cluster in. And the more things we have that don't care about the order, the cleaner the entire operation becomes.
How do you do the CRD management right now? Are you using the Helm chart or are you using some other kind of management?
We're using the Helm chart. We install one copy of the Helm chart to set up the CRDs, and then we set up everything else is through like the normal chart stuff.
So would you expect to do like a CRD deletion of the Helm chart and a CRD, like you can't delete the controller obviously until, well, or maybe that's what you're saying is that if you didn't want to orchestrate this process, you'd have like, I don't think Karpenter could stop itself from deleting. I mean, it could, I guess, if it held itself around and had a long termination grace period, but realistically, I think you have to orchestrate the CRD deletion before you orchestrate the deployment deletion, right?
I would love the ability to just like put them both into a deleting state and then let it sort itself out without bricking anything. Yeah.
I mean, to that point though, I would want the configurability to basically say, well, you know, if I have pod disruption budgets, right, that are available and within the cluster, are you going to forcefully terminate my nodes after X amount of time after the termination grace period, or like should we support pod disruption budgets, right?
Yeah. In general, like what I think should happen is that you can put every Helm chart that's being installed in that cluster into a deleting state simultaneously, and then eventually it'll all just sort itself out correctly when everything is deleted. Fine. Like in my ideal state, that's how everything works. Like we should not expect our users to have to order deletion of everything. We should just make it naturally flow.
Yeah, there's kind of inherently a dependent relationship though between the controller that is managing the finalizers on the management objects and like
I'm not intending for us to have a separate chart install for the CRDs versus not CRDs forever. We simply have this right now because we're doing fork things that involve API changes.
Yeah, my point was mainly you have a dependent relationship between, like, you have to remove the configuration before you remove the deployment, and
but the chart should sort that out for me in theory. Like,
yeah, I think it should be the orchestrator though. I don't think Karpenter itself can be responsible for doing that because it doesn't know when it's terminating, whether it's being terminated as a result of like an uninstall or whether it's being terminated as a result of an upgrade.
I mean, it should be the same from Karpenter's perspective. Like you're just going to be deleting. Yeah, I generally agree with you that like if we're using Argo CD to do the Helm install, if I'm doing manual Helm uninstall, like that should orchestrate the CRD versus non-CRD components correctly.
Operative word is should because Helm doesn't.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
That's a thing that should be fixed in Helm. Yeah. And that's generally my stance is that like that's where the entire industry should be moving, is that everything can be put into a simultaneous deleting state and delete gracefully, cleanly.
Yeah, I think it has to be CRD deletion before controller deletion, and the controller shouldn't care if it loses some of its APIs while it's running.
Yeah, but the answer to that question I don't think is relevant for like the exact thing you're talking about, which is the if like node claims should be gracefully terminating when Karpenter's uninstalled, right?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing from pretty much everyone here is like the optionality of having that ability to override it, which I think exists, is fine. But no one, well, it sounds like no one here is saying, I absolutely always want this to be forceful. Like there are cases where I wanted to gracefully migrate my pods. I'm not sure, Matt, do you have like tangible cases or is this just like an expectation, like hand waving, thinking about it at a high level?
For what? For wanting it to be.
Yeah, for wanting to gracefully deprovision Karpenter and have the pods migrate over to other capacity.
Yeah, no, my real use case is that, so like we're using Argo CD, we're using application sets extremely heavily to install Karpenter and a lot of other like platform level components across all of our clusters. What I would want to do is once the cluster is marked as no longer functional, like labeled or such for Argo CD, the application set will remove the Argo application that's responsible for deploying it to it. That application will remove the resources whenever that application is destroyed. And then that will naturally start to clean up everything that is on that cluster gracefully. And so like cluster teardown becomes like as trivial as us removing a label or changing a label like on that cluster as it's registered in Argo. So I think it's a very use case. It's a very real use case. There's a lot of blocks and hurdles in the way, but that's where I want to go.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious if like those applications are moving to other capacity or if they're just going to sit there trying to drain forever.
What do you mean? Like, do you think it won't succeed eventually for some reason?
Depends if you have PDBs, right? If you have PDBs in it, you can't move to
Sure,
other.
sure. No, it'll basically it'll be blocked. So assuming I'm not using termination grace period, that it's just unbounded for how long it can sit there gracefully, then
Yep.
this would require all of the user workloads that are running in the cluster to be torn down in order for it to eventually succeed, which is fine.
Got it.
Because they're also beholden to the same process where Argo's deploying them to the cluster via applications. They're also going to be put into a deleting state where they will eventually gracefully terminate. And if they don't, then that's on us to fix.
Yeah, so you don't actually care whether it's forceful or not, but it sounds like it is more surprising that this would be a forceful termination of all your workloads if it.
I
if
would,
that-
yeah, I definitely want the non-forceful, the graceful option to be available.
Okay.
That's my piece. So if anyone else wants to share their stories, happy to hear them.
Yeah, if you have any additional thoughts, please add to the issue. I don't think there were any comments at this point. It was kind of slipped into the cracks as far as I could tell. It's just the Kate spot and me talking back and forth.
Okay, sounds great. Any, oh, let's see one other. We can have a quick conversation here since we have time.
Yeah, I just wanted feedback on this. PR has been open for a while. Any comments, concerns for merging when we're looking to merge it, questions, so on. And for those that are unaware, this is for node disruption budgets or disruption budgets for nodes, right? Essentially, this is adding the capability of, instead of specifying a cron for the time at which I want this disruption budget to be active, instead of specifying a cron, you can specify a start and end time, and basically in a time date stamp or date time stamp to say, I have this time period. I want this budget to apply. And the reasoning behind that was, for operations teams, at least our operations teams, there may be times in a 3-week period in which we have 18 different hour to 2 hour to 3 hour to 6 hour time periods in which we want 0 disruptions to happen to the cluster or 10% of disruptions to happen to the cluster, right? And so scheduling all of those different periods as a part of a cron or a group of crons and so on, and having to be able to parse that quickly, give it to an operations team to basically just very quickly understand what it is that the cluster is going to do at different times is not really feasible, right? So this makes it very easy to just look at all the budgets, see if it's between 2 time periods, and then say, hey, it's not going to happen during these 2 things, right? Also, it takes into account time zones, and the time zones also work for crons. And technically, with the way the code is set up, you can have a cron schedule inside of a time period, a start and end date, and it will work just as fine as it normally does. It takes all of that into account. Jonathan, can we get this into V1? I can help. Did he leave?
Yeah, it was easier.
I think you have to drop off. I think you can start the rest of the team and have more of a conversation about this. I don't know if anybody has had time to really take a look at this PR.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I need some time to take a look too. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong. I just want to understand what this actually means. It might be worthwhile, since this is a change to the API surface, it might be worthwhile writing an RFC. I don't know if there was an RFC. That tells us exactly why and how this all works. Just because it's straight into the design and straight into the implementation. It might be worthwhile writing a quick RFC for this.
Right. My question is out of curiosity, if it's not crons, right? If I don't want to have to write crons for, you know, the 18 different times in a 3-week period in which I want to like not have the cluster disrupted, right? What is the other solution other than start and end date timestamps?
Right, yeah, no,
Beautiful.
you're right, like cron doesn't let you not do it after a certain time, for sure. But I think it's worth, that's definitely a gap that I think we want to solve here. It's just worth listing out like all these things in like an RFC. So we can read it, and then rather than like just looking at like the comments and your description, if that makes sense. But
Yeah,
I agree with your use case. It makes sense to me, yeah.
There's an open issue at the top of this, if you want to open that up. Yeah, I can move the discussion there if you prefer. Or turn this into basically the RFC. There's also some additional detail that I've talked to Nick and Jonathan about it. But we can turn this issue basically into an RFC.
Yeah. I guess I think I need some time. I don't know if the other maintainers need some time to look through it too, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think I see that only I think Nick made a comment last week, so I think we definitely all need to take some time to really understand it. And see what's exactly going on. If Nick was here, he would also be able to chime in, but since he's not, yeah, I will see if we can get more conversations going here, and then we can come back to it at the next working group, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
Sounds great. Cool. And I think that was the last thing, and since we are also over time, I think we can call it good here, if that's okay with everybody, unless there's anything else anyone wants to bring up. If not, okay, I think we can call it good for this working group meeting. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.